You need to prepare now before there's another conflict, because if a conflict was to suddenly start and combine with the current shortages we're all dealing with, the idea of rationing would happen very quickly. So in this video, let's talk about what's happened in the past that we can learn from and use to our benefit in order to be better prepared for when this inevitably occurs. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're going to talk about how the shortages we're dealing with now are nothing compared to what they could be if we were in the middle of a conflict. Things could get very tight. You really haven't seen anything yet until that situation happens. But we have seen what's going on around the world, and we do know that the concept of conflict is definitely more and more plausible the longer time goes on. So we know this is definitely a possible situation. And I am releasing this video today on D-Day because we're going to reference World War II as a guide to see what we might need to prepare for better in case a conflict was to arise, especially right now during the current shortages. And I do want to say that we need to remember the sacrifices made by the soldiers on that day that helped move the world into the direction that it's currently in. So of course we appreciate the sacrifice that was made. D-Day is very important. You should know about it, and if you don't, please do some research and learn. The bravery that was executed on that day, insanity. Now, listen. The shortages that we're currently facing are already difficult to overcome. There's a lot of issues with the supply chain, there's a lot of issues with the sources of trying to get the raw materials, and it's causing problems all around the globe. And that's without the concept of some kind of a large-scale conflict. But we know that a large-scale conflict could happen very soon here. And if you're preparing for shortages and you're preparing for things like conflict and you need to be better prepared for them to combine and create real problems, then hit the subscribe button below, because this is what we need to do. Look back into history, see what's there for us to learn from, and be better prepared because of it, okay? So, on August 28th, 1941, the Office of Price Administration was created by President Roosevelt. And that office's main duties was to cap the amount of price people could put on items. So to eliminate things like price gouging and to make sure that items didn't go through the roof in the sense of inflation, and to hand out ration cards to Americans to make sure that we were only able to give out what we needed without having to take away from the war front. And that is something that a lot of people lived through back in the 1940s, and it's something that a lot of us would feel is very foreign as of now. We would be very caught off guard and upset, I would assume, as a general population if we were suddenly told we could only buy so much of this or that, even if we have the money to be able to do so. But back then, the war effort was what was really important, and maintaining the idea of freedom around the world was extremely important to every single American. So people did their part and they dealt with the rationing. I'm not sure if that same idealism would be able to flow through the country freely right now, but this is what happened back then, okay? Ration books were given out. They were basically books full of stamps that had different color codings and different symbolism on them that allowed you to purchase different types of goods based on how many ration stamps you had. If you wanted to buy things like bacon, or if you wanted to buy things like sugar, you had to use different stamps, and then you had to basically present them or you couldn't get it. So one of the first things that was rationed back then, and something that we need to really think about, was tires. There's a huge rubber shortage going on, and of course with all of the factories in the country geared towards creating machinery of war, suddenly the ability to get sourced rubber and everything else that was happening on the other side of the planet where a lot of the rubber was coming from was making it impossible to acquire. And of course, during any type of conflict, there's embargoes, there's shipping and import and export issues. So this was a big one, and tires was like the first big thing to go in World War II. So do you have spare tires? Do you have extra tires for your vehicles? Do you even have a basic singular spare for your vehicle for if you break down on the side of the road? Think about this in a large-scale situation. If the world breaks out in a major conflict, tires could still be one of the first things to go because they're going to be needed, and that rubber is definitely going to be essential. So think about this. Back then, tires were only allowed to be owned by Americans with vehicles, and those vehicles could only have 5 tires per vehicle, aka you have your 4 on the car and you have the 1 as the spare. If you have extra tires laying around your garage, you would have been required to turn them in. So as preppers, this is something we need to consider, okay? I think extra tires and extra wheels is a great idea for a long-term bug-out vehicle situation, which is something that we'll be talking about here on the channel soon. But back then, you couldn't do that. You had to give everything up that you had other than that one spare, basically, okay? So mileage cards were also given out. And mileage cards, the whole point of those were to limit gasoline, and the limiting of gasoline wasn't to save gasoline, it was to save the tires, to make it so people could only drive so much and to keep the rubber alive for longer. 35-mile-per-hour nationwide speed limits were also introduced, and that's because they wanted to make sure that the tires were going to last longer. So you can see how all these different regulations had to be dropped into place just to save one resource. This is what happens during conflict. This is why you need to prepare now before something happens. Understand that all these different resources could be very scarce the second a conflict breaks out, especially if something happens now in the middle of a shortage, okay? So that was a big one. And this is all things that recently happened, in all honesty. We're talking about 70, 80 years ago. And that's not that far away, considering the fact that the government still has the power to do a lot of these same rationings if it ever comes down to it. And understand that you need to be acquiring what you need now before that ever becomes an issue. And you need to think about what's on this list I'm about to give you in the sense of what you might want to stock away. In case ever a conflict happens again, we can at least look at this list and say, well, these things went last time. Maybe we should think about it again this time, okay? So what else was basically rationed back then during the war? And of course, a lot of different things were, but here's the main things that were rationed. Cars, bicycles, fuel oil, kerosene, solid fuels. And when you say solid fuels, I mean, that means even things like coal or even things like your, fuel tablets for your camping stoves, things like that, okay? Rubber footwear, so any of your PPE, protective footwear. Shoes were rationed, okay, because obviously they used rubber and other materials in order to make them. Sugar, coffee, processed foods were also rationed. Meats were rationed. Canned meats were rationed. Cheese was rationed. Canned milk, so condensed milk, something that's a staple in most prepper pantries. Fats were rationed, so when you're talking about shortening, lard, all those things, they were rationed as well. And typewriters were rationed, okay? Well, obviously, nowadays you could look at that as even being laptops, and we know there's a microchip shortage. So could you imagine all these things being rationed now in this modern day, or apply the same concept to more modern ideas of the same concept, aka a typewriter as a laptop, okay? So when you look at that list, it really makes you realize what goes quickly in the case of a shortage as well as a conflict. And when you combine those two things, we should look at that list and check our inventory and say, do I have enough of this to deal with rationing that could be possible in the future? This is also one of those situations where at the end of the day, like we've talked about before with the Defense Production Act, okay? The government can still technically come and take what they want if that's what they need to do. I'm not saying that they're going to be allowed to by you or anyone else, but what I'm saying is that that's still within their realm of power from what they've decided. So you might have a lot of extra of these things, but at the end of the day, could become a problem in its own just by having extras of these things. So I wanted to bring this to your attention. I wanted to give you some things to think about and to relay some information regarding history that we can utilize today to look at and say, look, if this happens, this is what went last time. So I should probably take care of it this time before it happens and make sure I don't have to worry about being rationed out of getting what I need. And I think that's a high possibility, especially if conflict was to break out in the middle of an extreme supply chain shortage, which is where we are right now. It is hard to acquire almost everything. And right now I'm working on an awesome project where I'm going to modernize an M1A or civilian version M14 and turn it into what I think would be a applicable do-all SHTF style rifle. So that'll be coming out soon, but acquiring all the parts and everything I wanted in order to move that old school platform into the modern era and be more capable of doing what it is we might need to do in the sense of surviving an SHTF situation, it's much more difficult to get all the parts and everything put together to be able to do that. So that's just one example of trying to get what you need before these shortages occur. All these things here on the table are made from raw materials, including polymers, which are obviously from fossil fuels, steel, aluminum. There is a lot of different materials and manufacturing that goes into all these different items. Nylon is a great example for the sling over here. Another thing that was in high demand and high shortage during World War II. Nylons were also rationed, and AKA pantyhose. So if you're gonna rob a bank or if you wanna look good on your OnlyFans, you need to make sure you get your nylons now. or don't. Either way, this is exactly what we need to prepare for. And this is why I wanted to bring it to your attention. And I felt that D-Day was a great day to remember the sacrifice that was made during that war and to learn from it in the sense of being more prepared by what was rationed and what was in high demand and short supply back then during that era. Still important to reference and still important to learn about. So, just wanted to bring this to your attention. Prepare now before a conflict happens, and you might not have to deal with the rationing that would occur after the fact. And if you have anything else to add to the list of things that might be rationed, leave it in the comments below. And if you have great information about World War II and you're a history buff and you want to add some of your 2 cents to the conversation, please comment below. We love talking about all these things, and we love being able to communicate with each other here on this channel, because I learn a crap load of information from you guys in the comments, and I know that you guys either learn a lot or get a lot off your chest as well. So I appreciate both of those things. So without anything else to say about why you need to prepare now before a conflict, especially with all these shortages going on, that's going to be it for Magic Prep.